Right. You heard the breaking news last week. Michael Mann's court case was dismissed by BC Supreme Court, and they awarded court costs to my guest, Tim Ball. Now, I want you to hear the arc of this story, because it's kind of interesting that I don't know if Michael Mann has, if he's declared that he's been defeated, if he's accepted it. It sounds like he still might be opening up the option to continue this on. It's been going on for 10 years, for heaven's sakes. And I'm joined now by Tim Ball to talk about it. Tim Ball, of course, has his PhD in climatology with a focus on historical climatology, and he joins me now. Dr. Ball, thanks so much for being with me today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, so tell us what happened here, because it seems like I don't know if the professor was objecting to your entire characterization of his work, or if he just got his back up over one line that you said, that he teaches for Penn State, but he should be in the state pen because of the fact that this data could not be replicated. What was the nature of the dispute that you had?
Well, it was a combination of both of those. The comment about being in Penn State is what he listed in his defamation suit, saying that by saying that he should be in state pen, I was implying that he was a criminal. And, of course, actually, I do think he's a criminal. And the reason I'd say that is because Michael Mann was the guy that literally rewrote climate history. You see, one of the problems that these people that have pushed human-caused global warming all along has been that people like me who knew what the climate history was said, hey, 1,000 years ago it was much warmer than today in a period called the medieval warm period. And there was no possible way that could have been created by humans. This was a natural cycle. And so, actually, I have an email from a Professor Deming, D-E-M-I-N-G, and he said, I wrote an article that was questioning the hockey stick, and he said, I got an email from one of the perpetrators of it saying, we've got to get rid of that medieval warm period. In other words, we've got to rewrite the history. And that's exactly what they did. What Michael Mann did was that he took that challenge and using, there's so much wrong with what he did.
Well, but before we get into what he did, because I've seen these two graphs side by side, and it's very stark. If you go back, you see that, I don't know how far back his graph goes, but it looks like it's flat and stable, and then all of a sudden spikes up around 1850 or 1900, right. I think. Yes. And then the other one moves around quite a bit. If you go back 10,000 years, you see quite a number of rises and falls. And so how far back do you think we should be going when we're looking at the historical record?
Well, in reality, you should look at the whole 4.5 billion years of history of the Earth, because, we've gone through at least 9 ice ages. The most recent one ended just about 18,000 years ago. And if we take the last 10,000 years, which of course would be a reasonable amount of time for public understanding, it's been warmer than today for at least 90% of the last 10,000 years.
How do we know that? So when you're putting together, because we'll get to how he's put together his data, but I want to understand how other scientists have put together that 10,000 year temperature record. What is it that you look at? Is it very accurate, or is there a lot of guesswork involved in filling in the gaps too?
Well, there are what we can call educated guesses, but you never use a single source of data. Now, the historic record breaks down into the last 120 years or so, which we call the instrumental period, when we had thermometers that were measuring. But even in that 120 years, around 1880, for example, it only covered about 10% of the world's surface. But nonetheless, there were actual instrumental readings. Even today, by the way, we only have temperature records for about 25% of the world's surface.
Well, what about satellite records? Don't they have broader coverage?
Well, the satellites have broader coverage, but what are they reading? What are they telling you? I mean, when they first got the satellite records back, and they said, oh, look, it's 6 degrees Celsius. The Pacific Ocean is 6 degrees Celsius warmer than we expected. And then they went out with thermometers and stuck them in the ocean and found out that the satellite was misreading the data. So the satellites, and of course the other thing is the satellites can't see through clouds.
And so they wouldn't be able to get an accurate reading of what's happening on Earth. Why only 25%? Is that because the world is largely covered by ocean and you can only have reliable land-based thermometers?
Yes, 70% of the world is ocean. And then when you take the landmass, the mountains, the forests, the tundra, there's virtually no temperature stations. And then of all there are lots of stations, but only a very few of them are considered secure enough and accurate enough to provide an accurate measure. So that's why you narrow it down to only about 25% of the world covered with accurate stations.
Okay, so even still, instrumentation, as you mentioned, only existed since 1880. What do we use to try to assemble the temperature record before that?
Okay, that's the next good question, and the answer is we call it proxy data. That is that there are records that indicate temperature change. For example, tree ring data provides you a very good proxy indicator of temperature change. And then data we can get a core. Say you can go into a bog and take a core, and as you go down through the core, you see the changing seeds, the changing vegetation, and of course that reflects temperature change. But as you are also implying, as you go back in time, the degree of accuracy reduces quite significantly. So where we might be today, for example, it's considered that we're accurate within a half a degree Celsius. 120 years ago, if you're accurate within 1 degree Celsius, that's a pretty good approximation.
How far, when you talk about trees, I don't know how many trees have, when you talk about tree rings, how far back can you go with the oldest trees? How many hundreds, or can you even go back thousands of years or some of them?
Well, the oldest trees on Earth, in fact, they're the oldest living thing on the planet, are bristlecone pines, which are in the White Mountains in California. And some of those are 6,000 years old.
Oh, wow.
Okay, but the problem with them is that they've got a very long record, but they are influenced by local CO2. And therefore, they're not reflecting just the temperature. They're reflecting other factors. Now, with ordinary tree rings, the way they do it is that you overlap the tree rings so that you get one tree ring, and then you find an older tree and then overlap them until you can build up approximately about a 12,000 year record. So that's how they extend it back in time. But the problem with it is, of course, you can't just assume that the tree ring is a function of temperature. It's more likely in most areas that it's a function of precipitation, right? And so it's only in extreme examples, like in the year 1815 when they had no summer, you won't have a tree ring for that particular year. Well, that's obviously a direct effect of the temperature.
Okay, let me ask you then about ice core samples, because I thought CO2 got trapped in ice cores as well. And so is there a way to drill down in the Arctic or the Antarctic to get a more accurate read?
Yes. Well, what they do is they drill down, and they can go down to about 13,000 feet in the Antarctic. And that gives you about an 800,000 year record. And then what they claim they can do, and I question this dramatically, is they claim that they can identify individual years and take the bubbles that form for each year. But here's the problem with that. It takes 70 years for the snow that falls to become ice. So, in other words, your record, and then what's trapped in the bubble? Which year? And then what happens to the gas in that bubble, because it's contaminated with water filtering through the ice. So the ice core and ice bubble record, I place no faith in that whatsoever.
What makes you so sure, though, that we had a period that was warmer than what we have today?
Well, with the historical record, of course, we've got all sorts of so you can break it down. You've got the instrumental record, which covers to 1880, and then you can go back about 3,000 years with simply journals and diaries and other crop records and stuff like that. For example, some of the earliest known recorded material on weather patterns is in the pyramids in Egypt. And in the pharaohs, when they died, they wrote down the history. And, of course, you see there how they protected the people from droughts. So you could reconstruct from that kind of written record. But that, as I said, that only covers about 3,000 years. And, of course, it really doesn't cover much of the world because there are not an awful lot of written records for most of the world. So all you can do is as I said, approximate. And if you go back before 120 years of record, if you're within 1 degree Celsius of what the approximate global temperature was, you're very, very close.
Okay, so it's very, very complicated to try to get to construct the historical temperature record. So what is it then? And you gave us a lot of the different variables that might go into it. So how did Michael Mann construct his hockey stick, this notion that everything was stable going along for thousands of years, then all of a sudden just spiked up because of human emissions in the last couple hundred?
Well, because he assumed that tree rings represented temperature. That's the first mistake that he made. And then he found that all the tree ring data that he had didn't give him the curve that he wanted. So he only used one tree ring record, and that was the bristlecone pine.
He used one tree record for the entire data set?
Yeah. And of course, it was the one that everybody said you don't use because it's contaminated. And so the blade the handle of the hockey stick, which covers almost 1,000 years, is based upon one tree ring record. And then he had the problem that as that tree ring record came into the 20th century, so starting around 1880, the temperature, according to the tree ring record he was using, showed a decline in temperature. And so you could read his notes. This is on the internet, where he said, I had to hide the decline. So what he did was he took the modern instrumental temperature record and grafted it on to the end of the tree ring record.
Okay, it sounds like you're saying he cherry-picked a particular tree sample that gave him the data that he wanted for the early part of the record, and then used the latest temperature data, grafted on to create this huge spike.
The blade, yeah. And of course, the thing is, when you look at that blade, that sudden upturn in temperature that he has as the blade of his hockey stick, it's the accuracy of it is plus or minus 33%.
Okay, so how did this become the iconic graph that everybody referred to and that has driven so much of the climate discussion?
Because these people were being paid and worked at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that their goal was to show that humans were causing global warming and climate change, and therefore they created the data that justified that. And of course, the hockey stick showed, until these humans and their industry appeared in the 1880s, the temperature was going down slightly and was almost level. And then, suddenly, there it is. That's proof that humans are the cause. That's the whole objective of everything they've done.
Okay, let me tell you, I just want to read out what Michael Mann's response to the initial reporting was. He said, there have been some wildly untruthful claims about the recent dismissal of libel litigation against Tim Ball circulating on social media. Here's our statement. The defendant Ball did not win the case. The court did not find that any of Ball's defenses were valid. The court did not find that any of my claims were not valid. The dismissal involved the alleged exercise of a discretion on the court to dismiss a lawsuit for delay. I have an absolute right of appeal. My lawyers will be reviewing the judgment, and we will make a decision within 30 days. The provision in the court's order relating to cost does not mean that I will pay Ball's legal fees. This ruling absolutely does not involve any finding that Ball's allegations were correct, in fact, or amounted to legitimate comment. In making his application based on delay, Ball effectively told the world he did not want a verdict on the real issues of the lawsuit. So that's his comment. What's your counter comment to that?
Well, the counter comment is that I did want it. He's the one. We had a court time scheduled for February 20th of 2017. We were scheduled to be in court. He canceled it. He delayed it, not me, and so he's the one that's consistently delayed it, and he's had now almost 9 years to produce his evidence, and he hasn't done it. And the court ruling in the dismissal said that he made all sorts of claims and provided no evidence to support his claims. So what he's interpreted there is the complete opposite of the facts.
Okay, let me pause you because I want to understand a little more about what it is you were seeking in getting from him in the first place that he didn't produce. Because one of the reasons why it was adjourned with condition that he submit his R2 numbers in a timely fashion. So for those who are not scientifically inclined, you'll have to explain what all of that means, what it is you were looking for, and then maybe just offer a commentary on why he didn't produce it. Dr. Tim Ball is my guest. He had this lawsuit against him dismissed. He was awarded costs, but as you heard, Michael Mann might not be over just yet. We'll find out in a few more weeks' time. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Ball when we return on 770 CHQR. All right. So we're trying to get to the bottom of what really happened in this court case. So one of the things that happened back in July of 2017, is that when it was? No, it was back in, they were supposed to have a court date, February 20th, 2017. And they adjourned with condition. The major condition was that Michael Mann produce all documents, including computer codes, by February 20th, 2017, and he failed to meet that deadline. So Dr. Tim Ball is my guest. We're talking about this lawsuit. Dr. Ball, what is it that you were seeking? What were you asking him to produce?
Well, we were asking him to produce the formulas and the computer code, that he used to create the hockey stick graph. And now people, statisticians and others, people like Steve McIntyre, are able from the actual graph itself to reproduce a lot of the data, but the actual formulas that he used are not reproducible, and that's what's missing in it. So it's like you've got say 80%. You know that what he did was wrong. But the actual, he's able to say, well, no, because you haven't got that 20%, you can't draw those conclusions. Well, then we say, well, show us the 20%. And he said, I don't have to.
Well, this is why I'm confused, because I thought the whole scientific method was and I had somebody on talking about this new fluoride study that came out, and she went through great lengths to describe the multitude of processes she went through to verify her data. There was a second study that replicated the same things. That's kind of what science is that other people are able to replicate what you do, and that's where you get to the consensus, isn't it?
Right.
Like, I don't understand how you can not make that data public and still have the consensus stand.
Well, that's the whole point. And then everybody, all of our listeners have been in school and done math tests, and what's the one instruction? Show your work.
That's right. And so I think I've read one article where it says that this is a proprietary computer program. And I still, again, that seems to be at odds with what they're trying to do when you're trying to get to the bottom of things in science. So can you explain that to me?
Yes. Well, Michael Mann was taken to court in the state of Virginia by Ken Cuccinelli, who at the time was the Attorney General of the state, and he later ran for governor, but he didn't win that. But he took him to court along with the University of Virginia and said, look, you've got to disclose all of this information, how you created this graph, and the opposition, or Michael Mann, fought back and said, no, I don't. Unfortunately, and by the way, Cuccinelli said, well, you've got to show it, but because the taxpayers pay for your research, therefore it really belongs to the taxpayer. Secondly, you use the data to force upon the world energy and environment programs that are costing trillions of dollars that are not necessary, and so that you have an absolute obligation to disclose all this data, but the court that they were in ruled no, because Michael Mann said no, it's my intellectual property. And of course, you see this is the big battle that's going on in the world now with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific. 25% of that is all about intellectual property, the stealing of intellectual property by China. This is at the center of so much of what's going on in the world in terms of research and trade and everything else. And so what Michael Mann did was he got the court to rule that he didn't have to disclose the information because it was his intellectual property.
I want to tell people where they can see it. If you want to look up Michael Mann, Tim Ball, and then historical data. And then you can look up images, and you can see these two images that are starkly different. One clipping along at a very low rate and then spiking up. It looks like around 1900. And then yours shows a very large warm period, much warmer than today, between 900 and 1400. And then it goes cold, and then it comes, and now temperatures are rising again. Here's what I'm confused by. What's the right data set to use? Is there any consensus anymore in the scientific community?
Well, there is amongst those people that understand what's going on. Those that have a political agenda, no, there's no consensus other than that humans are causing warming and we've got to shut down the industry and stop producing CO2. But that was the focus right from the start. I mean, if you go and look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was set up to investigate the climate change issue by Maurice Strong, that Canadian who did so much damage to the world. But when he set up the IPCC, he gave them the definition that they only look at human causes of climate change. But the world thinks that they are looking at all of climate change, all of natural climate change, and they're not. And so, for example, the world is cooling down because the sun is cooling down, but that's not included in their models. So they're continuing to tell the world that the world's going to get warmer.
You know what? I've got so many of my listeners saying there are so many conflicting reports. Who do I believe? Like, this is the problem. How do you get accurate information?
Well, unfortunately, in this age of chaos and fake news, it's virtually impossible. All I can do is say to people, well, look, go and look at the actual records of the temperature of the past for the last 1,000 years, the last 10,000 years, and then start to figure out how much that is a variation has occurred, and then compare that with what's the cause. And you'll find out that CO2 is not the cause of the temperature change, that virtually all of it is due to changes in the sun. But because their definition of looking at climate change was only human causes, they didn't look at the sun.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how this ultimately ends up getting resolved. If he continues it on, I will very likely have to chat with you again. But thanks so much for giving us the update.
Oh, you're very welcome, and just keep an eye on Mother Nature. She'll tell the truth.
You got it. That's Dr. Tim Ball, climatologist. He has a PhD in climatology with a focus on historical climatology. I know, guys, I'm just as frustrated as you are. That's why you have to read broadly and hear from all perspectives, because as much as you're told that there's a consensus, when you hear that account of how this hockey stick data was put together, it kind of is a head scratcher why it became the global norm, isn't it? Someone says, is that the same one that Al Gore used in his movie? Yep, I think that's the same one. Let's take a pause. When we get back, we're going to be talking